Someone asked, what is inauthenticity? When it comes to this process of awakening, you could say that authenticity is congruence between your internal experience and how you perceive yourself, others, and the world, and how you communicate that. So the first step along the way on this process of awakening is typically the recognition that we are suffering. The recognition that we are uncomfortable with who we are and how life is. This is one of those things that some people who come in contact with this message find triggering, because they'll say, I'm not suffering, I'm happy, my life is good, and go on to justify that with a description of the circumstances and qualities they possess or their life possesses that explain why they're happy, why they don't suffer. And of course, this is fine. I don't argue with people's beliefs. But for me, when I was suffering, I would have answered that way. I didn't actually know the depth of my own suffering. I didn't know the depth of my own avoidance of emotion. I didn't know how disconnected I had become from being present, from moment to moment absorption into life. I knew I was suffering at some level, but I had also developed an identity that said, to get along in life, you have to put on a certain kind of front. You have to have a persona that interfaces with others in a way that protects you from being exposed or being criticized, humiliated, etc. This is something I wasn't fully aware of, but I was functioning out of it. So this is what I mean by being inauthentic. Although I was uncomfortable most or all of the time in life, I wouldn't have told anybody that. And in a sense, I wouldn't even have told myself that, because to believe that I was stuck in this body and this mind for decades, and that there's no way to feel comfortable, relaxed, at peace, was a scary proposition. So part of me believed that I could find a way to feel relaxed, at ease, or find what I thought I needed to become a happy person. But by the time I was involved in that thought process, that was already built out of a separation from who I really was. It was built out of inauthenticity. So I was living and identifying with a completely inauthentic way of being. So I can't say everybody lives this way, but when I talk about this topic or this subject, invariably, many people tell me that this is what they resonate with, that this experience of being separated from yourself in a way that's hard to identify, or separated from life in a way that's hard to identify, and yet really seems to kind of gnaw at you. This is described to me by people on a daily basis. So my suspicion is that the vast majority of people live some degree of this before they start waking up. And then once you start waking up, once you go through that first shift, that first awakening, you could almost say that that first awakening is really just a recognition that you've been very inauthentic for a long time. Because all of a sudden the filters that kept you in a state of mental seeking, imagining things are better than they are, imagining how you're going to find finally whatever it is you think you need to complete you, isn't there anymore. Or you can't just escape to that and fully believe it, or even partially believe it. So you find yourself in this strange place where you still utilize that mental space of escape, avoidance, daydreaming, seeking, when things are too uncomfortable. Not that you fully know you're doing it, but it just seems to happen on its own. And then other times you feel quite present. And that presence can take the quality of enjoyment, peace, flow, but it can also have the qualities of discordance, dissociation, disorientation, discomfort. dysphoria, basically. So one thing I want to point out about this is if you find yourself here, if you've gone through that initial shift and you're surprised by how raw things feel, how uncomfortable things can be, and how inauthentic you had been in the past, or at least how separated from yourself, from your emotions, from those around you had been, that's okay. This is par for the course. Everybody goes through this. And knowing that this is another quality of presence can really relieve a lot of that resistance to your process. What this means is that presence is deeply peaceful. It's flow. It's absorption. It's also uncomfortable at times when identity structures are still operating. It's raw. It feels unguarded. But that's also presence. So just knowing that the qualities of presence are varied and will change and shift a lot after awakening for some time can help give you a bit of relief to realize nothing has gone awry or off the rails. This is how it is to feel yourself inside and outside of identity structures, sometimes several times a day. And so these fluctuations are necessary for this process to continue to unfold. You could say the body-mind, or reality looking, feeling, hearing through the body-mind, and even thinking through the body-mind, needs this texture. It needs the contrast of meing and being to continue to wake up, to continue to see what's real and what's not real, and ultimately to find the place where real and unreal are not even two. So this first shift, this is the first movement into authenticity. And it can sound critical to say we live a life of inauthenticity, and I don't mean it that way. It's not anything we're doing on purpose. Well, sometimes it is. Sometimes to various degrees we are manipulative with our identities. We are manipulative with our personas and the ways we interact and communicate. But largely it's unconscious. It's a behavioral pattern that we've learned and has been imprinted upon us from others. So inauthenticity isn't a judgment. It's not a moralistic statement. It simply means we're not congruent. We're distanced mostly from ourselves. We're inauthentic in the sense that we don't know how to rest in that pure sense of being, the pure sense of I or I am as a starting point. And from there, we can allow this process to continue to unfold, and we start to really understand experientially, without having to describe or explain it, the nature of presence itself, the nature of depth, of intimacy, of interpenetration of the senses, of true non-agency, knowing this ecstasy of the flow of life and not pushing against anything. So inauthenticity, you could say, is the first barrier. Quite simply, the first barrier is just recognizing I do indeed suffer at some level. Can't even put my finger on it, but something bothers me about the way life is. The promises didn't turn out to be what they were supposed to be. So that's really what I mean by inauthenticity, is just not recognizing our own suffering. So to address this, it's a matter of compassion. Have some compassion for yourself, for your own suffering. Give yourself the gift of being willing to admit that there is suffering going on. I don't know what went wrong. I don't know where I started to identify with a mental self or when I got so entangled in thoughts, but I do know it's inherently uncomfortable. So that's the first movement of authenticity. And then after the shift that I described earlier, this awakening, then we've pulled the curtain back, in a sense. We've really started to see what's going on down in the emotion body. And then the roller coaster ride begins. And of course, there are further refinements beyond this. And ultimately, at some point, when we start to address the equanimity aspect, we start to really get to the subtle areas that cause us to start to separate from life, from ourselves, and see that there's nothing there that actually has to do that. The reactive body doesn't exist. It was a habit the whole time. And then authenticity stops making sense because there's so much fidelity in the phenomenal experience and the awareness of that experience that there's no place anymore to step back to imagine things could be other than they are, to hypnotize ourselves with a sense of mental control. We're too busy just enjoying the flow of life. And now intimacy and authenticity mean the same thing. Authenticity now means allowing ourselves to be completely taken by the phenomenal flow of life, by the sounds and sensations and forms and colors and movements. This is where gentleness, effortlessness, and innocence return. And it's seen clearly they never were lost. They've never been anywhere but here. There's never been anything but this just as it is. There never has been separation. There was never anything apart. There's never been anything or anyone that could have been inauthentic in the first place.